Have you ever picked up a hitchhiker who vanished from your car while you were still driving? Tonight, we're covering 11 deeply disturbing events from Washington State that will make you question reality itself. Welcome back to Bleak Fears. Names and identifying details have been altered to protect the people involved, but these accounts are real. I've verified each one personally. What would you do if you realized someone was living in your apartment that nobody else could see? Drop your location and current time in the comments below, because you might want company after hearing these. If you're ready to dive into the darkest corners of the Pacific Northwest, smash that subscribe button, and I promise you'll get stories like this every single night, right here. Let's begin. My name is Caleb, and I'm a marine biologist. I've spent the better part of my career studying coastal ecosystems along the Pacific Northwest, so driving long stretches of desolate highway in the rain is just part of the job. On November 19th, I was heading back from a research site near the Kino River on Highway 101, the kind of road that hugs the Olympic Peninsula coastline like a dark ribbon. It was close to 9 in the evening, and the rain was coming down in sheets. The kind of rain that makes your windshield wipers feel completely useless no matter how fast you set them. The fog was rolling in from the ocean, thick and gray, swallowing everything beyond 20 feet in front of my headlights. I'd driven this route dozens of times, but that night it felt different. Heavier somehow, like the darkness had weight to it. I was about 15 miles south of Kalaloch when I saw her standing on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me because nobody in their right mind would be out walking in weather like that, especially not on this stretch of highway, where there's nothing but forest on one side and steep drops to the ocean on the other. But as I got closer, my headlights caught her fully. She was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a thin white dress that was completely soaked through. Her dark hair was plastered to her face and shoulders, and she wasn't even trying to shield herself from the rain. She just stood there with one arm, raised slightly, thumb out in that universal hitchhiker gesture. But her expression was blank, empty. Something about it made my stomach tighten, but I couldn't just leave her there. The next town was miles away, and hypothermia was a real concern in weather like this. I pulled over about 20 feet past her and watched in my rearview mirror as she walked toward the car. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was walking through water. When she reached the passenger door, she didn't knock or gesture. She just stood there, waiting until I leaned over and opened it from the inside. The dome light came on, and I got a better look at her face. She was pale, almost gray in the harsh light, with dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. Her lips had a slight blue tint that confirmed what I'd suspected about the cold. "Jesus, you must be freezing. Get in," I said, reaching back to grab a blanket I kept in the back seat for emergencies. She slid into the passenger seat without a word, and immediately I noticed the smell. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was wrong. Like salt water and something organic. Something that had been underwater too long. The kind of smell you encounter sometimes in tide pools when you're collecting samples. She pulled the door closed, and we sat there for a moment in silence except for the hammering rain on the roof and the rhythmic squeak of my wipers. "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the highway. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared straight ahead through the windshield at the fog-shrouded road, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The blanket I'd offered her sat untouched between us. That's when I noticed her dress was still dripping, water pooling on the floor mat beneath her feet. I turned the heat up higher. "You need to stay on the road," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow cutting through all the noise of the storm. "Don't stop. Don't pull over. No matter what you see." I glanced at her, trying to read her expression, but she was still staring straight ahead. "Okay," I said slowly. "Are you in some kind of trouble? Do you need me to call someone?" I reached for my phone in the cup holder, but she spoke again before I could grab it. "There's a red house, 2 miles ahead on the right. Don't stop there. Whatever you do, don't stop at the red house." Her voice had an urgency to it now. and her hands gripped her knees tightly enough that her knuckles went white. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What red house? What are you talking about?" But she didn't answer. She just kept staring ahead, and I noticed her lips were moving slightly, like she was counting or praying under her breath. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, and I had to slow down to 40 miles per hour just to make sure I didn't drive off the road. My headlights barely penetrated 15 feet ahead now. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes. Then, through the fog and rain, I saw it. A house set back about 50 yards from the road, barely visible through the trees. And it was red. Not the cheerful red of a barn, but a deep dark red that looked almost brown in the limited light like dried blood. There were no lights on inside, no cars in the driveway, but something about it made my chest tighten. I felt an almost physical pull to slow down, to stop, to turn into that driveway. My foot actually eased off the gas pedal without me consciously deciding to do it. "Don't stop." Her voice was sharp now, almost panicked. "Keep driving. Stay on the road." I pressed the accelerator again, forcing myself to look away from the house, and we passed it. As we did, I could have sworn I saw movement in one of the dark windows, a pale shape that might have been a face watching us pass. I blinked, and we were beyond it, swallowed again by the fog and the endless dark road. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I realized my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "What's in that house?" But when I turned to look at her, the passenger seat was empty. Completely empty. The blanket was still folded exactly where I'd left it, untouched. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing slightly on the wet road before I got it under control. I threw the gear into park right there in the middle of the highway and turned on the dome light, looking around frantically. "Hello? Where did you go?" I checked the back seat, even though I knew that was impossible. There was nowhere for her to have gone. The doors hadn't opened. I would have heard it, felt the change in air pressure, something. But she was just gone, like she'd never been there at all. Except the passenger seat was still wet, soaking wet. Water had pooled in the depression where she'd been sitting, and when I touched it, my fingers came away cold and smelling of that same salt and decay ocean smell. The floor mat beneath where her feet had been was drenched, water still dripping from it. I sat there for a long moment, rain pounding on the roof, fog pressing in on all sides, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I heard it. A soft tapping on the passenger window. Tap, tap, tap. I turned slowly, terrified of what I might see, but there was nothing there. Just fog and darkness and rain streaming down the glass. I didn't wait to see if it would happen again. I put the car in drive and got out of there, driving well over the speed limit despite the conditions, not caring if I got pulled over. I didn't stop until I reached Aberdeen, 25 miles north. I pulled into the first gas station I found with lights on and sat in the parking lot with the engine running, still shaking. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the passenger seat again, it was still wet. I took out my phone with trembling hands and searched for anything about that stretch of highway, that red house, disappearances, anything. That's when I found it. A small article from a local paper dated 3 years earlier. A young woman had been driving alone on Highway 101 during a storm. Her car had been found pulled over near mile marker 162, driver's door open, engine still running. She was never found. The article included a photo, and my blood went cold. It was her, the woman I'd picked up. Same face, same dark hair. The search had focused on the ocean side of the highway. They'd assumed she'd gone over the edge, been swept away by the current. But there was something else in the article. A mention that her car had been found near an abandoned property, a red house that had been the site of an unsolved murder-suicide in the 1970s. I drove home that night but didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her sitting in my passenger seat, water dripping from her hair, lips moving silently. The next morning, I went back to my car in full daylight, thinking maybe I'd imagined how wet the seat had been, that maybe it was just rain I'd tracked in. But when I opened the door, there they were. Footprints. Wet footprints on my floor mat, small and bare, the toes clearly defined. They hadn't dried overnight. They were still wet, still smelling of salt water and decay. I took pictures, though I don't know why. Who would I show them to? Who would believe me? I ended up calling the local sheriff's office from the article and told them I had information about the missing woman case. When the deputy arrived to talk to me, I told him everything, showed him the pictures of the wet footprints, the article I'd found. He listened patiently, took notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. I started seeing a therapist 2 weeks later because I wasn't sleeping, couldn't focus on my work. Every time I got in my car, I'd check the passenger seat compulsively. My therapist diagnosed me with acute stress disorder and prescribed sleeping pills, but they didn't stop the dreams. In the dreams, I'm driving that same stretch of highway, and she's always there in the passenger seat, dripping water, whispering the same thing over and over. Don't stop at the red house. Except in the dreams, I do stop. I pull into that driveway, and when I look at the house, all the windows are filled with pale faces staring out at me, and she's standing among them. It's been 8 months now, and I still can't drive Highway 101 at night. I've rerouted all my research trips, added hours to my travel time just to avoid that stretch of road. My colleagues think I'm being ridiculous, that I'm letting an overactive imagination get the better of me. But they weren't there. They didn't see her face or smell that smell or feel the wrongness of her presence. They didn't watch her vanish from a locked car. And they don't have wet footprints that reappear in their passenger side floor mat every few weeks, no matter how many times they clean the car or replace the mats. I stopped trying to explain it. But I know what I saw. I know she was real, or had been real once. And I know that something is still out there on that highway, near that red house, waiting in the rain and fog. Sometimes I wonder if I was supposed to stop that night, if she was trying to warn me, or if she was trying to lure me there. I don't know which possibility frightens me more. My name is Cooper, and I work the graveyard shift as a custodian at Pike Place Market in Seattle. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, and I actually prefer working when the place is empty. During the day, Pike Place is chaos. Thousands of tourists, street performers, vendors yelling about their fresh salmon, the constant smell of flowers, and fish and coffee all mixed together. But from 2 to 6 in the morning, it's just me, my cleaning cart, and the echo of my footsteps on those old wooden floors. At least, that's what it's supposed to be. I've been doing this job for 3 years now, and for the most part, it's been fine, boring even. I put on my headphones, listen to podcasts, mop the floors, take out the trash, make sure everything is ready for the vendors when they start arriving around 5:30. The market has this weird energy at night, though. It's over 100 years old, and you can feel that age in the walls, in the way the floorboards creak, in the cold draft that comes up from the lower levels, even in summer. I'd heard the usual stories from other workers about weird noises, things moving on their own, the typical ghost tales you'd expect from a place this old. I never paid much attention to any of it until about 4 months ago. It was a Tuesday night, or technically Wednesday morning, around 3. I was working on the main arcade level, mopping near one of the fish vendor stalls, when I saw someone walking toward me from the direction of the south entrance. My first thought was that maybe one of the vendors had come in early, but that didn't make sense because I'm the only one with keys to this section at this hour. As the figure got closer, I could see it was a man wearing maintenance coveralls, the old-fashioned kind with the dark blue fabric and the patch pockets on the chest. He was maybe 50 yards away, walking with this slow, deliberate pace, and he was staring right at me. Not looking around, not checking anything, just staring directly at me while he walked. I pulled out one of my earbuds and called out to him, "Hey, "We're closed. You're not supposed to be in here." He didn't respond. He just kept walking toward me with that same steady pace, and I started to feel uncomfortable. There was something off about the way he moved, too smooth, too purposeful. When he got to about 20 feet away, I could see his face clearly under the overhead lights. He was pale, older, with deep-set eyes, and this completely blank expression. No emotion at all. He just stared at me, and then, without breaking stride, he turned and walked down one of the side corridors that leads to the lower levels. I stood there for a minute trying to figure out what had just happened. Protocol says I'm supposed to report any unauthorized people in the building immediately, so I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor. He told me to check the security office and review the cameras, see if I could figure out how this guy got in. The security office is on the lower level, so I headed down there, my heart beating a little faster than usual. When I pulled up the footage from the main arcade for the last hour, I watched myself mopping, saw myself stop and look up, saw myself clearly talking to someone and then watching them walk away. But on the camera, I was alone, completely alone. There was no man in coveralls, no one walking toward me, just me standing there, talking to empty air. I rewound it 3 times, checked different camera angles. Nothing. I was the only person in that building. I didn't sleep well that day. I kept thinking about his face, that blank stare, the way he'd moved. When I came back for my shift the next night, I told myself I'd imagined it, that I'd been half asleep or maybe had gotten dizzy from the cleaning fumes. But at 3:15, I saw him again. This time, I was down on the lower level, near the old cold storage rooms that most of the current vendors don't even use anymore. I came around a corner, and he was standing there at the end of the hallway, maybe 40 feet away, just standing completely still in those same coveralls staring at me. The overhead lights down there are dim and spaced far apart, so he was partially in shadow, but I could see his face. Same guy, same blank expression. My mouth went dry, and I felt this wave of cold fear wash over me. I didn't say anything this time. I just stood there, frozen, and we stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then he turned and walked through a doorway into one of the old storage rooms. I heard his footsteps, heard the door creak. I forced myself to walk down there, my hand shaking, and when I reached the door, I pushed it open. The room was empty. Just old wooden shelves covered in dust and a few scattered cardboard boxes. No other exit, no windows, nowhere he could have gone. This kept happening. Every single night for the next 2 weeks, I'd see him. Sometimes on the main level, sometimes down in the corridors below, once standing outside the window of the security office looking in at me. Always the same coveralls, always that dead stare, always walking away before I could get close enough to really confront him. And every single time, when I checked the security footage, I was alone. I started having trouble sleeping during the day. I'd lie in bed in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, seeing his face every time I closed my eyes. I stopped listening to podcasts during work. I needed to hear everything, needed to know if he was coming up behind me. The market started to feel hostile, like the building itself was watching me. I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before. The way certain sections always felt colder than others. The smell down in the lower levels, that mix of old fish and brine and something else, something stale and wrong. The way the lights would occasionally flicker in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I finally broke down and did some research. I went to the public library on one of my days off and started going through old records about Pike Place Market, looking for anything about maintenance workers, accidents, deaths, anything that might explain what I was seeing. It took me 3 days of searching through archives and old newspaper microfiches, but I found something. In June of 1983, a maintenance supervisor named Warren Holloway had died in the market's lower levels. He'd been working alone early one morning, doing some kind of electrical repair work, when he'd been electrocuted. They'd found his body 6 hours later near one of the old cold storage units. There was a photo with the article, a staff photo from the previous year. The moment I saw it, my blood turned to ice. It was him, the same face, the same deep-set eyes. And in the photo, he was wearing those exact coveralls, the old-fashioned kind with the dark blue fabric and the patch pockets. There was even a name patch visible on the chest, though I couldn't make out what it said in the grainy newspaper reproduction. I brought this information to my supervisor, showed him the article, explained what I'd been seeing. He listened, looking uncomfortable, and then told me that I wasn't the first person to report seeing someone matching that description. 2 other custodians over the years had mentioned seeing a man in old coveralls walking the halls at night. One of them had quit because of it. My supervisor suggested I take a few days off, get some rest, maybe talk to someone. He didn't say it directly, but I could tell he thought I was having some kind of breakdown. But I couldn't afford to quit. I needed this job, so I kept working, and I kept seeing him. The encounters started to change, though. He stopped walking away. He'd stand there, staring at me for longer and longer periods. Once, I was cleaning near the entrance to the lower levels, around 3:30 in the morning, and I looked up to find him standing about 10 feet away. We stood there, looking at each other for almost 5 minutes. I was too terrified to move. His mouth was slightly open, and I could see that his lips were moving, like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Then slowly, he raised one arm and pointed down toward the lower levels, toward the old cold storage area where he'd died. He held that pose, arm extended, finger pointing, for maybe 30 seconds. Then he turned and walked away into the shadows. I haven't been down to that section of the lower levels since then. I make sure all my work keeps me on the main arcade or in the upper corridors. I've rearranged my entire cleaning schedule to avoid that area. My supervisor noticed and asked me about it, but I just told him I was being more efficient with my route. The truth is, I'm terrified of what I might find down there, or what might find me. I still see Warren sometimes, usually at a distance now, watching me from doorways or standing at the end of hallways. He doesn't approach anymore. He just watches. I've thought about quitting so many times, but something stops me. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's the fact that I've gotten used to him in a weird way. Or maybe it's because some part of me feels like he's trying to show me something, trying to communicate something important. Whatever happened to him down in those lower levels 42 years ago, I don't think he's at peace with it. And I don't think he's going to stop appearing until someone figures out what he's trying to say. Last week, I was filling out some paperwork in the security office around 4 in the morning, and I glanced up at one of the monitor screens showing the main arcade. There he was, standing in the center of the frame, staring directly at the camera, staring at me. His mouth was moving again, forming words I couldn't hear, and his hand was raised, pointing down, always pointing down toward those cold storage rooms. I sat there watching him on the screen for almost 10 minutes, and he never moved, except for his lips and that pointing finger. When I finally worked up the courage to go out to the main arcade, he was gone. But something had changed. I could feel it. The air felt heavier, colder, and I knew, somehow I just knew, that eventually I'm going to have to go down there. I'm going to have to go down to that cold storage area and find out what he's trying to show me. I just don't know if I'll be the same person when I come back up. Have you ever felt like something was trying to communicate with you, but you were too afraid to listen? Drop your answer in the comments below. My name is Charles, and I'm a land surveyor. I've worked in this profession for nearly 20 years now, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, and I've spent more time alone in the woods than most people spend with their own families. I'm comfortable with isolation. I know how to read terrain, how to navigate dense forest, how to handle myself when I'm miles from the nearest road. Or at least, I thought I did. What happened to me last April near the town of Concrete in Washington has made me question everything I thought I understood about being alone in the wilderness. I was contracted by a development company to survey an old logging tract that hadn't been actively used since the early 90s. The area was about 8 miles east of Concrete, accessible only by a network of deteriorating logging roads that were more mud and potholes than actual pavement. It was early spring, that time of year, when the snow has mostly melted, but everything is still soaked from runoff, when the forest smells like wet earth and rotting vegetation and new growth all at once. I'd been working the site for 3 days, taking measurements, marking boundaries, doing the technical work that's second nature to me after all these years. The forest there was typical Cascade mountain territory, dense with Douglas fir and western red cedar, the ground covered in ferns and moss, everything dripping with moisture even when it wasn't actively raining. On the 4th day, I noticed something odd. I was working along what used to be a main haul road, now overgrown with saplings and blackberry bushes, when I spotted boot prints in the mud. Fresh ones. The prints were clear enough that I could make out the tread pattern, and they were roughly the same size as mine, maybe a men's size 10 or 11. That wasn't necessarily strange. Sometimes you'd run into hunters or hikers in areas like this, people exploring old logging roads. What bothered me was the pattern. The prints appeared to be following my exact path from earlier that morning. I could see where I'd walked, and these other prints were right on top of mine in some places, parallel to them in others, like someone had been tracking my movements. I called out, thinking maybe it was another surveyor or someone from the development company checking on my progress. No response. Just the sound of water dripping from branches and the distant call of a raven. I shrugged it off and kept working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. You know that sensation, that primitive awareness that tells you you're not alone even when you can't see or hear anyone. I had that feeling for the rest of the day, strong enough that I kept stopping my work to scan the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. I never saw anyone. When I packed up my equipment that evening and hiked back to where I'd left my truck on a wider section of the old logging road, I checked behind me constantly. The boot prints were still there in the mud, still following my route, but they always stopped about 50 feet behind where I was standing. Never closer than that. Always exactly 50 feet. The next morning, I came back determined to figure out who was out there. I'm not a paranoid person by nature, but this was starting to feel like harassment, maybe even a safety issue. If someone was following me around in the woods, I needed to know who and why. I set up a trail camera on a tree overlooking one of the main paths I'd been using, angling it to capture anyone who might be walking through. Then I went about my normal routine, working my way through a different section of the tract. Around noon, I stopped for lunch and decided to check the camera. I hiked back to where I'd mounted it, pulled out the SD card, and reviewed the footage on my phone. What I saw made my stomach drop. The camera had captured me walking past earlier that morning, just like it was supposed to. But in the background, barely visible among the trees, there was a figure. A person standing about 50 feet behind me, partially obscured by a thick cedar trunk. They were completely motionless, just standing there watching me pass. The quality wasn't great because of the distance and the forest shadows, but I could make out what looked like outdoor clothing, maybe a jacket and pants in dark colors. What disturbed me most was how still they were. Unnaturally still. No shifting weight, no movement at all, just standing there like a statue. I fast-forwarded through the footage. About 10 minutes after I'd passed, the figure stepped out from behind the tree and walked along the same path I'd taken, heading in the direction I'd gone. Their gait was strange, too measured, like they were carefully placing each foot in exactly the right spot. Then they moved out of frame. I sat there on a fallen log, staring at my phone, trying to process what I'd just seen. Someone was definitely following me, and they were doing it deliberately, carefully, staying just far enough back that I wouldn't spot them easily. I thought about calling the sheriff's office, but what would I say? Someone is walking in the woods near me. That's not illegal. I had no proof they meant me any harm. but every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong about this. I decided to confront whoever it was directly. I repositioned the trail camera to cover a different angle. Then I deliberately walked down one of the old logging roads, making noise, making it obvious where I was going. I found a good spot where I could double back through the underbrush and come up behind my own path, hoping to catch this person by surprise. It took me about 20 minutes to loop around through the dense forest, moving as quietly as I could. When I got back to a position where I could see the logging road, I crouched behind a massive, rotting stump and waited. Sure enough, after about 5 minutes, I saw movement. A figure emerged from the tree line, walking slowly, down the road in the direction I'd gone. But something was wrong. Very wrong. From this angle, from behind, I could see that their movements were off. Their legs moved in a way that didn't quite match normal human walking, almost like they were mimicking the motion but not getting it exactly right. Stiff, mechanical, and they were wearing what looked like the same type of outdoor gear I had on. Similar color jacket, similar pants, like they were trying to blend in or maybe trying to look like me from a distance. I felt a cold spike of fear run down my spine. This wasn't just some curious hiker. This was something else. I stood up, ready to shout at them, demand to know what they were doing, but before I could make a sound, they stopped walking. Just stopped dead in the middle of the road. Then slowly, they turned their head to look back over their shoulder, directly at where I was hiding. I couldn't see their face clearly because of the distance and the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me. We stayed like that for maybe 10 seconds, me frozen behind the stump, them standing in the road with their head turned at an impossible angle, too far around to be comfortable for a normal human neck. Then they turned back around and continued walking down the road, disappearing around a bend. I didn't follow. I stood there shaking, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I packed up all my equipment, retrieved my trail camera, and got out of there. I didn't even finish the day's work. I just left. That night, in my motel room in concrete, I went through all the footage from the trail camera. I found 3 more instances of this figure appearing in the background of shots, always at that same distance, always watching. In one clip, they were standing behind a tree, and I could see their hand gripping the bark. Their fingers were too long. Not grotesquely long, but just slightly wrong, maybe an inch or 2 longer than they should be. In another clip, I caught a brief glimpse of their face as they turned slightly. It looked human at first glance, but there was something off about the proportions, the spacing of the features. It looked like someone wearing a mask of a human face, or like something had studied human faces and tried to recreate one but didn't get all the details right. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about those 2 long fingers, that wrong face, the way they'd turned their heads so far around to look at me. I should have quit the job right then. I should have told the development company I couldn't complete the survey and walked away. But I'm stubborn, and I needed the money. And part of me was angry. Angry that something or someone had scared me out of the woods that had been my workplace for 2 decades. So I went back the next day, but I brought something with me. A hunting knife on my belt and a canister of bear spray on my chest rig. I told myself, if this person came near me, if they got within 30 feet, I'd spray them and call the police. I worked faster that day, trying to finish the survey so I could get out of there for good. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was marking a corner boundary when I heard it. Footsteps, not trying to be quiet, just walking steadily through the brush, coming toward me. I spun around, yanking the bear spray from its holster, holding it out in front of me. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't see anyone through the dense undergrowth, but I knew they were close, maybe 20 feet away. "I know you're there," I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. "Show yourself right now, or I'm calling the police." Silence. Then, from somewhere in the trees to my left, I heard my own voice. "I know you're there. Show yourself right now, or I'm calling the police." It was my voice, my exact tone, my exact words, even the slight crack in the middle, played back at me like a recording. I felt something break inside my mind, some fundamental sense of reality cracking. That's when I ran. I didn't pack up my equipment properly, didn't mark my last position, didn't do any of the professional protocol I'd followed for 20 years. I just ran back toward where I'd parked my truck, crashing through ferns and jumping over fallen logs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace, staying that same 50-foot distance. When I finally reached my truck and threw my gear in the bed, I looked back down the logging road. They were standing there at the edge of the tree line, just standing and watching. I got in, started the engine, and drove out of there without looking back. I called the development company that night and told them I was done, that I couldn't complete the survey. I didn't give them a real explanation, just said there were safety concerns with the site. They weren't happy, but they paid me for the work I'd completed. I haven't been back to that area since, and I don't plan to ever go back. I still work as a surveyor, but I've changed how I operate. I don't take jobs in isolated areas anymore. I make sure there are other crew members with me. I check over my shoulder constantly, even in broad daylight on sites close to major roads. My wife noticed the change in me, and eventually I told her some of what happened, though I left out the worst details. She thinks I had some kind of encounter with a disturbed person, maybe someone living off the grid who didn't want anyone on their territory. Maybe that's what it was. But I don't think so. I think about those two long fingers, that wrong face, the way my own voice was played back at me from the forest. Whatever was following me in those woods wasn't human, or if it was human once, it isn't anymore. What would you do if you heard your own voice coming from the darkness? Tell me in the comments. My name is Roman, and I'm a hospital physician working the emergency room night shift at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. I've been doing this for almost 6 years now, and in that time I've seen just about everything you can imagine. Trauma cases, overdoses, cardiac arrests, psychotic breaks, the full spectrum of human suffering that comes through those doors between midnight and 8 in the morning. You develop a certain emotional distance in this line of work. You have to, or it'll destroy you. But what started happening 3 months ago shattered that professional detachment completely, and I'm not sure I'll ever get it back. It began on a Tuesday night in late February. The ER was unusually quiet for a change. Just a few minor cases in the waiting room, nothing critical. I was catching up on paperwork at the nurse's station when my pager went off. The display showed a code that indicated a patient needed immediate attention in room 417. I acknowledged the page and headed that direction, assuming it was one of our frequent flyers having another episode, or maybe a new admission that had just come up from triage. When I got to the 4th floor and turned down the hallway where room 417 should be, I stopped walking. There was construction barrier tape across the corridor, the yellow and black striped kind, and a handwritten sign that said the entire wing was closed for renovation. I'd completely forgotten about that. They'd shut down that section almost a month ago to update the electrical systems and replace some aging infrastructure. I stood there confused, looking at my pager again to make sure I'd read it correctly. Room 417. But that room was definitely behind that barrier tape, in a section of the hospital that should be completely empty. I figured it must be a system error. Maybe someone had accidentally input the wrong room number, so I headed back downstairs to check with the charge nurse. She pulled up the records and frowned at her computer screen. According to the system, no page had been sent to my number in the last 30 minutes. There was no record of any call from room 14 or anywhere else. She suggested my pager might be malfunctioning and said she'd have IT look at it in the morning. I went back to my paperwork, but the incident nagged at me. Hospital paging systems are pretty reliable. They don't just randomly generate room numbers and send phantom pages. About 2 hours later, it happened again. My pager went off with the same code, the same room number. Room 417. This time, I didn't go up there. I went straight to the charge nurse and showed her my pager while it was still displaying the message. She checked the system again, and again there was no record of any page being sent. She looked genuinely puzzled and said she'd put in a maintenance request for my pager right away. She gave me a backup pager to use for the rest of the shift, and I clipped it to my belt, putting the malfunctioning one in my locker. I was back seeing a patient with a possible appendicitis when the backup pager went off. I glanced down at it, expecting a legitimate call from somewhere in the ER. Room 417. My hands went cold. This was a completely different pager, one that had been sitting in the charge nurse's desk drawer and hadn't been used in weeks. There was no way it could have the same malfunction. I walked back to the nurse's station, and I must have looked rattled because the charge nurse immediately asked if I was okay. I showed her the backup pager. She went pale and checked her computer again, typing faster now, checking different screens and databases. Nothing. No page had been sent from room 417 or from anywhere else on the 4th floor. The entire wing was showing as offline in the system, which made sense since it was under construction. She suggested maybe there was some kind of electrical interference from the renovation work causing signals to cross somehow. But even as she said it, I could tell she didn't really believe that explanation. Neither did I. I made a decision that probably broke about 15 hospital protocols. I told her I was going up to the 4th floor to physically check room 417, just to make sure there wasn't actually someone in there who needed help. She started to object, said the construction area was off limits and potentially unsafe, but I was already walking toward the stairs. The 4th floor hallway was dark except for emergency exit lights spaced every 30 feet or so. The construction barrier was still up, and I ducked under it, feeling like I was crossing into somewhere I definitely shouldn't be. The air smelled different here, like dust and exposed wiring and something else, something vaguely chemical that I couldn't identify. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum as I walked down the corridor, passing rooms with open doors, showing empty beds, and equipment covered in plastic sheeting. I found room 417 about halfway down the hall on the left side. The door was closed, which seemed odd since all the other rooms had been left open. There was a piece of paper taped to the door at eye level, but the lighting was too dim to read what it said. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The paper had a single word written on it in black marker, just one word that made absolutely no sense to me. Sorry. That was it. Just sorry, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. I reached for the door handle, and that's when I heard it. A sound from inside the room, a rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a hard surface. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. It was steady, mechanical, almost like a heartbeat. I put my hand on the door handle and felt it was ice cold, much colder than it should have been. The tapping continued. I knocked on the door, called out to ask if anyone was inside. The tapping stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I tried the handle, but the doctor was locked. I knocked again, louder this time, and identified myself as a doctor. Nothing. Just silence and that strange chemical smell getting stronger. I stood there for probably a full minute trying to decide what to do. Finally, I backed away from the door and headed back toward the stairwell. I'd report this to security, let them handle it. This was beyond my responsibility. Back in the ER, I filed an incident report and told security about the tapping sound and the locked room. 2 security officers went up to check it out while I waited anxiously at the nurse's station, watching the clock and jumping every time my pager went off with legitimate calls. The officers came back 20 minutes later looking confused. They said they'd checked room 417 thoroughly. The door hadn't been locked when they tried it. The room was completely empty, no equipment, nothing. They'd searched the entire closed wing and found no evidence that anyone had been up there. No footprints in the dust except mine and now theirs. No signs of forced entry or unauthorized access. One of them mentioned that the room was noticeably colder than the surrounding area, probably an HVAC issue related to the construction. They found the piece of paper I described, the one with sorry written on it, but they'd removed it and thrown it away, figuring it was just construction worker graffiti or something. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, I got paged to room 417 11 more times. Different shifts, different days, completely random intervals. Sometimes my own pager would go off, sometimes the backup. Once even the phone in the doctor's lounge rang, and when I answered it, all I heard was silence, and then a soft voice saying, "Room 417," before the line went dead. I stopped responding to these calls. I'd check with the nurses' station each time to confirm it was a phantom page, and each time there would be no record in the system. Other staff members started noticing my increasing paranoia. I'd flinch every time a pager went off anywhere near me, even when it wasn't mine. I started having trouble sleeping during the day between shifts. I'd lie in bed and hear that tapping sound in my head. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I finally broke down and did some research into the history of room 417. It took some digging through old hospital records and newspaper archives, but I found something that made my blood run cold. 8 years ago, a patient had died in that room under circumstances that had triggered an internal investigation. The details were vague in the official records, sealed due to privacy laws and the ongoing investigation, but I managed to find a few news articles from the time. A woman in her early 40s had been admitted with what appeared to be routine complications from a minor surgery. Her condition had deteriorated rapidly overnight, and by the time staff realized how serious it was, she'd gone into cardiac arrest. The resuscitation attempts had failed. The investigation had focused on whether there had been proper monitoring, whether warning signs had been missed, whether someone had made a critical error in her care. The investigation had eventually concluded that while there had been some lapses in protocol, nothing rose to the level of negligence or malpractice. But the woman's family had disagreed. They'd filed a lawsuit that was later settled out of court. I became obsessed with finding out more details. I talked to nurses who'd been working at the hospital back then, trying to piece together what had actually happened that night. Most of them didn't want to discuss it, but one older nurse finally told me the truth after I'd bought her coffee and promised not to use her name in any official capacity. She said the patient in room 417 had used her call button repeatedly that night, saying she felt something was wrong, that she couldn't breathe properly, that something was very wrong with her chest. The overnight staff had been dealing with multiple critical cases in the ER and had been severely understaffed. Someone had responded to her calls, checked her vitals, and told her everything looked normal, that she was probably just anxious. They'd given her something to help her sleep. She'd coded 40 minutes later. The nurse, telling me this story, had tears in her eyes. She said everyone involved had been devastated, that they'd all second-guessed themselves for years afterward, wondering if they could have saved her if they'd taken her concerns more seriously. After learning this, I couldn't shake the feeling that the pages I was receiving weren't random system errors. I know how that sounds. I'm a physician, a man of science, someone who deals in evidence and measurable reality. But I couldn't explain the pages any other way. It was like room 417 itself, or something connected to it, was trying to get someone's attention, trying to make sure what happened there wouldn't be forgotten or dismissed. The pages continued for another month. Then, suddenly they stopped. I haven't received a single page from room 417 in the last 3 weeks. The renovation on that wing finished, and the rooms are back in use now. I've deliberately avoided being assigned any patients on the 4th floor. I've thought about requesting a transfer to day shift, or maybe to a different hospital entirely. My wife has noticed the change in me. I'm jumpy, distracted, not sleeping well. She thinks I'm burned out, that I need a vacation or maybe a career change. Maybe she's right. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Last week, I was walking past the 4th floor on my way to a consultation, and I glanced down the hallway toward where room 417 is located. There was a patient being wheeled into that room on a gurney, a routine admission from the look of it. and standing in the doorway, watching them wheel the patient in, I saw a woman. She was translucent, barely visible, like she was made of fog or smoke. She looked directly at me, and even from that distance I could see the expression on her face. It wasn't angry or vengeful. It was sad, deeply, overwhelmingly sad. Then she turned and followed the gurney into the room, and she was gone. I stood frozen in that hallway for several minutes, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I haven't told anyone about what I saw. Who would believe me? But I check the admission records for room 417 now, compulsively, several times per shift. So far, everyone admitted to that room has been discharged without incident. So far. But I keep waiting for my pager to go off again. Waiting for that familiar code and room number to appear. Waiting to see if whatever is in room 479 needs my help. Or if it's trying to tell me something I'm still too afraid to understand. Have you ever ignored something important until it was too late? Let me know what you think below. My name is Kimber, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington in Seattle. Anyone who's been a grad student knows the financial strain that comes with it. You're surviving on a stipend that barely covers rent, eating instant noodles more often than you'd like to admit, and constantly calculating whether you can afford both groceries and textbooks in the same week. So when my previous roommate moved out last September to live with her boyfriend, I was desperate to find someone to split the rent. My apartment is in the University District, one of those old converted houses that got chopped up into units back in the 70s. It's nothing special, just 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a bathroom with tiles that were probably installed during the Nixon administration. But it's walking distance to campus, and the rent is reasonable if you're splitting it with someone else. I posted ads everywhere, campus bulletin boards, online housing groups, every roommate finder website I could locate. For 3 weeks, I got nothing but responses from people who seemed sketchy or couldn't afford the deposit or wanted to pay in cryptocurrency or some other red flag situation. I was getting genuinely worried about making rent when I got an email from someone named Marley. The email was brief and professional. She said she was also a graduate student studying remotely, needed a quiet place, could pay first and last month's rent plus deposit immediately, and preferred to keep to herself. She asked if she could move in at the start of October. It seemed almost too perfect, but I was in no position to be picky. I emailed back asking when she wanted to see the place and meet in person. Her response said she trusted my description, that she was currently out of state finishing up some research, and asked if she could just transfer the money and move in on October 1st. She'd come by that evening to pick up keys. Looking back, I should have found that strange. Who rents a room without seeing it first or meeting their potential roommate face to face? But I was so relieved to have someone who could pay and seemed reliable that I ignored my instincts. She sent the money through a bank transfer that afternoon, and it cleared immediately. Real money, not a scam. I was ecstatic. On October 1st, around 8 in the evening, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, there was a set of keys on the doormat, but nobody in the hallway. I stepped out and looked both directions, but the corridor was empty. I called out, thinking maybe she'd stepped away to grab another load from her car. No response. Then I heard movement from inside the apartment, from the direction of the second bedroom. I walked back inside, and the bedroom door that had been open was now closed. I knocked on it, said hello, introduced myself, told Marley I was glad she'd arrived safely. A voice from inside, muffled by the door, said she was tired from traveling and was going to sleep, and we could properly meet tomorrow. That was the beginning of what I can only describe as the strangest living situation imaginable. Over the next few weeks, I never actually saw Marley. Not once. But I knew she was there. Or at least, I knew something was there. I'd wake up in the morning and find evidence of someone having been in the kitchen. A cup would be in the sink that wasn't there the night before. The coffee maker would be slightly warm, like it had been used recently. Food in the fridge would slowly disappear. The bathroom would have condensation on the mirror, like someone had just showered. Her bedroom door was always closed, and I'd hear sounds from inside. Footsteps, drawers opening and closing, the creak of bed springs. Once I heard what sounded like her talking on the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. I left notes asking if we could coordinate schedules, or at least have a quick conversation about house rules. The notes would disappear, but I never got written responses or any direct communication. Rent appeared like clockwork, though. On the 1st of each month, I'd find cash in an envelope slipped under her bedroom door, pushed out into the hallway. The exact amount, always in crisp bills that looked fresh from an ATM. I tried knocking on her door multiple times during different hours of the day and night, trying to catch her when she might be awake or available to talk. Sometimes the sounds inside would stop immediately when I knocked, like someone was holding their breath and waiting for me to leave. Other times, there would be no response at all, just complete silence. I started to wonder if I was living with someone who had severe social anxiety or maybe agoraphobia, some condition that made normal interaction impossible for her. I tried to be understanding and patient, telling myself that as long as she paid rent and didn't cause problems, maybe it was okay if she wanted to be completely private. But it kept getting stranger. I'd come home late from the library and hear her bedroom door open and close in the middle of the night, hear footsteps moving around the apartment while I was in my room with the lights off. I started staying awake sometimes, listening, trying to figure out what she was doing. The footsteps would move from her room to the kitchen, pause there for several minutes, then move to the bathroom, then back to her room. The same pattern, night after night, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. I never heard the apartment door open or close, so she wasn't leaving. She was just moving through our shared space while I was supposedly asleep. One night, I decided to try something. I waited until I heard her door open, heard the footsteps move toward the kitchen, and then I quickly got up and turned on my bedroom light and opened my door, trying to catch a glimpse of her. The apartment was empty. Completely empty. The kitchen light was off. Nobody was there, but I could still hear footsteps. They were continuing their pattern, moving from the kitchen toward the bathroom, but I couldn't see anyone. I stood there frozen, listening to invisible footsteps walk right past me in the narrow hallway. I felt a slight change in air pressure as they passed, like someone had walked through my personal space, and I caught a faint scent that I couldn't quite identify, something like vanilla and old paper. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed with all my lights on until dawn, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe I'd been more asleep than I thought, and had dreamed it. Maybe the sounds were coming from the apartment above or below us, and I'd just gotten confused about the location. But I knew what I'd heard. Those footsteps had been inside my apartment, moving through the hallway, passing within inches of where I stood. Over the next few weeks, I became increasingly paranoid and sleep-deprived. I'd lie awake, listening for sounds, trying to catch evidence of what was happening. I set up my laptop to record video of the hallway outside my bedroom while I slept. When I reviewed the footage in the morning, I'd see myself getting up, turning on lights, opening my door, and looking around, but the hallway was always empty in the video. No evidence of anyone else, but the timestamp on the footage would show gaps, moments where several minutes would pass in what felt like seconds, like the recording had been paused and restarted without me noticing. I started mentioning the situation to friends, carefully, trying not to sound completely insane. I'd say I had a really private roommate that I never saw and ask if they thought that was weird. Most of them laughed it off, said I was lucky to have a roommate who stayed out of my way, that they'd kill for that kind of arrangement instead of dealing with someone who ate their food or left dishes in the sink. But one friend, someone I'd known since undergrad, looked at me seriously and asked if I'd ever actually confirmed that Marley existed. If I'd seen mail addressed to her, packages delivered, anything concrete that proved another person was living there. I realized I hadn't. There was no mail for her, no packages, no friends coming by to visit. Nothing but those sounds, the missing food, the rent money, and the evidence that someone or something was occupying that second bedroom. I decided to try something drastic. One afternoon, when I was certain I was alone in the apartment, completely silent and still for hours, I tried the handle on her bedroom door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, not sure what I'd find inside. The room was furnished. There was a bed, neatly made with plain white sheets, a dresser with the drawers closed, a small desk with nothing on it, a closet with the door shut. But everything looked staged, like a furniture showroom or a hotel room waiting for a guest. There was no personal belongings visible, no laptop or books or clothes lying around, no photos on the wall or clutter on the surfaces. It looked like nobody actually lived there. I opened the dresser drawers and found them empty except for one drawer that had a single item, a small notebook with a plain black cover. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, the same sentence written over and over in neat, identical script. "I'm sorry I'm not real." That same sentence, hundreds of times, filling page after page. I dropped the notebook like it had burned me and backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. I went to my own room, grabbed my phone, and called my friend. I told her everything, my voice shaking, barely coherent. She told me to get out of the apartment immediately, to come stay with her, that we'd figure out what to do from there. I started throwing clothes into a bag, hands trembling when I heard it. A knock on my bedroom door. A soft, polite knock. I froze, staring at the door. Another knock, and then a voice. "Kimber, I'm sorry I haven't introduced myself properly. Can we talk?" The voice was pleasant, feminine, completely normal. I didn't respond. I didn't move. "I know you went into my room," the voice continued. "I know you saw the notebook. I'm sorry if that frightened you. I didn't mean for you to find it." I grabbed my bag and my keys and moved toward my window. "We're on the second floor, but there's a fire escape." "Please don't leave," the voice said, and now there was an edge to it, something desperate. "Please, I need you to see me. Nobody sees me. Not my family. Not my professors, not the people I pass on the street. You're the only one who hears me. You're the only one who knows I'm here." I climbed out the window, onto the fire escape, and didn't look back. I made it to my friend's apartment and stayed there for 2 days, barely eating, barely sleeping, trying to figure out what to do. She suggested I call the police, but what would I tell them? That I had a roommate who paid rent, but I'd never seen, and now her bedroom had a creepy notebook. They'd think I was having a breakdown. Finally, I worked up the courage to go back to the apartment, but I brought my friend with me. We went during broad daylight, and I made her promise she wouldn't leave my side. When we opened the door, the apartment was exactly as I'd left it. My bedroom door open, my window still ajar from where I'd climbed out. But the second bedroom door was open now too. We looked inside together. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no notebook, nothing. Just bare walls, an old carpet, and an empty closet with the door hanging open. My friend looked at me with concern, asking if maybe I'd been more stressed about school than I'd realized, if maybe I should talk to someone professional about what I'd been experiencing. But the money was real. I checked my bank account, and all those rent deposits had happened. $1,500 every month for 4 months had appeared in my account, transferred from an account number I didn't recognize. When I tried to trace it, the bank said the account didn't exist in their system. No record of where the money had come from. I've lived alone in that apartment ever since. I can afford it now because I picked up extra work and cut my expenses to the bone. The second bedroom stays empty, door closed. Sometimes I still hear sounds at night. Footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards in that empty room. Sometimes I find a cup in the sink that I don't remember using or notice that food has gone missing from the fridge. But I don't investigate anymore. I don't ask questions. I just live my life and try to ignore the evidence that maybe Marley never left, or maybe she was never really here in the first place, Or maybe something else entirely is happening that I don't have the framework to understand. I'm graduating this spring, and I'm counting down the days until I can move out of this place and never come back. Would you live alone, or would you rather have a roommate you could never see? Drop your thoughts below. My name is Josiah, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've been driving 18-wheelers across the country for nearly 15 years now, mostly running routes up and down the West Coast between California and Washington. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. I like the rhythm of the road, the hum of the engine, the endless miles of asphalt stretching out ahead. You see a lot of strange things when you're driving through the night, things most people never encounter because they're home asleep in their beds. Drunk drivers weaving across lanes, animals that shouldn't be anywhere near highways, weather that comes out of nowhere and turns deadly in minutes. I've seen it all, or at least I thought I had, until what happened on Deception Pass Bridge last March. For those who don't know, Deception Pass Bridge connects Whidbey Island to the mainland north of Seattle. It's a stunning piece of engineering built back in the 1930s, towering over a narrow channel where the water rushes through with incredible force. During the day, it's beautiful, all green water and forested islands and dramatic cliff faces. At night, it's a different beast entirely. The bridge sits almost 200 feet above the water, and when you're driving across it in the dark, especially if there's fog, it feels like you're suspended in absolute nothingness. I'd crossed that bridge hundreds of times over the years, usually around 3 or 4 in the morning when traffic was non-existent, and I could make good time on my route north. I'd never had any issues with it before that night. It was March 7th, a Wednesday, and I was hauling a load of electronics from a distribution center in Tacoma up to a retailer in Bellingham. I'd left around midnight, planning to make the delivery by 6 and then grab breakfast and a few hours of sleep at a truck stop I knew. The weather forecast had been clear, but as I got closer to Deception Pass around 3 in the morning, I ran straight into fog. Not the light misty stuff you sometimes get near the coast, but thick, dense fog that reduced visibility to almost nothing. I slowed way down, turned on my hazards, and crept forward at maybe 20 miles per hour. My headlights just bounced back off the fog, barely illuminating 10 feet in front of my rig. I'd driven through plenty of fog before, but this felt different. Heavier, like the air itself had turned solid. I was about halfway across the bridge when I felt the truck lurch and heard a sound that every driver dreads, a sharp mechanical grinding followed by a loss of power. My engine sputtered and died. I managed to get the rig over to the shoulder, or what passes for a shoulder on that narrow bridge, and put on my emergency flashers. I sat there for a minute trying to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Just a clicking sound and nothing else. I grabbed my phone to call roadside assistance and saw I had no signal. Not even one bar. That was unusual because I'd had decent coverage just 5 minutes earlier, but sometimes these coastal areas have dead zones. I tried the CB radio next, but all I got was static. Not normal static either, but this rhythmic pulsing sound that made my head hurt if I listened to it too long. I decided to wait it out, figuring the engine might just need a few minutes to cool down, or reset, or whatever mechanical issue was causing the problem. I turned off all the interior lights to save battery, and sat there in the dark cab, surrounded by fog so thick I couldn't even see the guardrail that I knew was only about 8 feet away. That's when I first noticed them. Shapes in the fog. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, creating patterns out of nothing the way your brain does when you stare into darkness too long. But these shapes were too defined, too consistent. They looked like people standing along the bridge railing. I counted at least 10 of them, maybe more, spaced out evenly, all facing the same direction toward the water below. None of them were moving. They were just standing there, perfectly still, like statues. I felt my pulse quicken. My first thought was that maybe there'd been an accident I hadn't seen, and these were people who'd gotten out of their cars. But I hadn't passed any other vehicles, and I would have noticed if there'd been cars pulled over before my truck died. I rolled down my window and the cold air that came in smelled wrong. It smelled like salt water and decay, like something that had been underwater for too long and then washed up on shore. I called out, asked if anyone needed help, if everyone was okay. No response. The figures didn't move, didn't turn to look at me, just kept standing there, facing the water. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. Something about this was very wrong. I tried the engine again, desperately, hoping it would start, but got the same clicking sound and nothing more. I sat there for maybe 5 more minutes, watching these figures through my windshield, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. Then one of them moved. The movement was wrong, jerky and mechanical, like someone who'd forgotten how joints are supposed to work. The figure turned toward my truck, and even though I couldn't see any details through the fog, I felt its attention lock onto me. Then another one turned, then another. Within seconds, all of them had rotated to face my direction, and they began walking toward the truck. Not running, just walking with that same wrong mechanical gait. Their movements were synchronized, like they were all being controlled by the same signal. I locked my doors, which I know is ridiculous because a door lock isn't going to stop anything that really wants to get in, but it was pure instinct. They kept coming, getting closer, and as they got nearer to my truck, I could start to make out more details. They looked human at first glance, but everything was slightly off. Their proportions weren't quite right. Arms, a little too long, heads tilted at angles that should have been uncomfortable, legs moving in a way that suggested the joints bent in places they shouldn't. Their faces, when I could finally make them out through the fog, were the worst part. They had features, eyes and noses and mouths, but they were arranged wrong, like someone had described a human face but had never actually seen one and tried to recreate it from memory. And they weren't wearing clothes exactly, but something that might have been clothes once, tattered and soaked through, hanging off their bodies like seaweed. The smell got stronger as they approached, that rot and saltwater smell, so powerful now that it made my stomach turn. They formed a semicircle around the front and sides of my truck, maybe 15 feet away, and just stood there, staring at me. I could see their mouths moving, like they were talking or chanting, but I couldn't hear any sound. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. I couldn't move, couldn't think, could barely breathe. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, but I was paralyzed by fear and the absolute wrongness of what I was seeing. Then one of them, the closest one directly in front of my truck, raised its arm and pointed at me. The others mimicked the gesture, all of them pointing at me in perfect unison. Their mouths kept moving, and I realized with horror that they were moving in sync too, all saying or mouthing the same words at exactly the same time. I still couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could read lips well enough to make out 2 words being repeated over and over. Come down. They wanted me to come down, to get out of the truck, to go to them, or maybe to go over the railing into the water below. I don't know which, and I didn't want to find out. That's when something inside me snapped out of the paralysis. I turned the key in the ignition, not really expecting anything to happen, but the engine roared to life immediately. Just started up like there'd never been a problem at all. I didn't question it. I threw the truck into gear and hit the gas, not caring about the fog or the narrow bridge or anything except getting away from those things. They didn't try to stop me. They didn't move at all as I accelerated past them. In my side mirror, I could see them through the fog, still standing there, pointing, getting smaller as I put distance between us. I drove probably twice the safe speed for those conditions, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel, until I was off the bridge and back on solid ground. The fog started to thin out almost immediately once I was past the bridge, and within a mile it was completely clear, like I'd driven out of one world and into another. I pulled into the first rest area I found and sat there with the engine running, trying to process what had just happened. I checked the time on my phone, And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. According to my phone, it was 4:30 in the morning. I'd been on that bridge for over an hour and a half, but it had only felt like maybe 20 minutes. I had signal again, full bars, like there'd never been a problem. I tried to tell myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing, that maybe there'd been a gas leak in the cab, or I'd had some kind of episode from exhaustion or stress. But my clothes reeked of that salt water and decay smell. It was in my hair, on my skin, soaked into the upholstery of my truck. I could smell it for days afterward, no matter how many times I washed everything. I finished the delivery run on autopilot, barely remembering the drive to Bellingham. When I got to the warehouse, the crew there asked if I was okay because apparently I looked terrible. I told them I'd had a rough night and left it at that. I filed my delivery paperwork and then drove to a motel instead of the truck stop I'd planned on. I paid for a room and took the longest, hottest shower of my life, scrubbing my skin until it was red and raw, trying to get that smell off me. It helped a little, but I could still catch traces of it for weeks afterward. I called my dispatcher and told him I needed a few days off for personal reasons. He wasn't happy about it, but I'd been a reliable driver for years, so he approved it without too much pushback. I spent those days trying to research what I'd seen. I looked up everything I could find about Deception Pass, its history, any reports of strange occurrences or disappearances. There wasn't much. The bridge has a reputation among locals for suicides, which is tragically common for iconic bridges. There are signs posted with crisis hotline numbers and barriers that have been added over the years to try to prevent people from jumping. But I couldn't find anything about multiple disappearances or strange sightings. I did find some references to Native American legends about the area, stories about spirits in the water, and places where the boundary between worlds was thin, but nothing specific enough to explain what I'd experienced. I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That I saw some people standing on a bridge in the fog who moved weird. They'd think I was insane or wasting their time. I went back to work after that week off, but I changed my routes. I told my dispatcher I needed to avoid runs that went through Whidbey Island, gave him some excuse about family issues in that area that would be distracting. He shuffled my assignments around, and I haven't had to drive across Deception Pass Bridge since that night. I've thought about it constantly, though, about those figures and their wrong faces and their synchronized movements, about that missing hour and a half, about the smell that lingered for weeks. Most of all, I think about those two words I saw them mouthing. Come down. I wonder how many people over the years have stood on that bridge late at night when the fog rolls in, have seen those figures, and have actually listened to that command. How many people jumped not because they wanted to die, but because something called to them from the water below? I don't have answers. I just know that I'm never going back there. Whatever is on that bridge, whatever lives in that fog, it's still there waiting. And I pray I never see anything like it again. If you were stuck on that bridge, would you stay in the vehicle or try to run? Tell me what you'd do. My name is Ezekiel, and I live in a Capitol Hill apartment building that was built sometime in the 1920s. You can tell by the architecture, the high ceilings with decorative molding, the original hardwood floors that creak with every step, the radiator heating that clangs and hisses all winter. It's the kind of building that has character, which is real estate code for old and slightly falling apart, but charming enough that you overlook the issues. I'm a software developer, work from home most days, which means I spend a lot of time in this apartment, maybe too much time. I moved into my unit about 18 months ago, a small one-bedroom on the third floor with a decent view of the street below. When I signed the lease, the landlord mentioned casually that the apartment directly above mine, Unit 412, was vacant, and had been for a while. He said something vague about it being between tenants and undergoing some minor updates. I didn't think much about it at the time. For the first few months, everything was fine. The building is old, so you hear things, footsteps from neighbors, Water running through pipes, doors closing, the usual sounds of people living their lives in close proximity. I got used to the ambient noise pretty quickly. Then in November, around 6 months after I moved in, I started noticing something specific. Every night at exactly 2:47 in the morning, I'd hear sounds from the apartment above me. Not random sounds, but a very specific pattern. 7 footsteps moving from what would be the bedroom area toward what would be the living room. A pause. Then 7 footsteps going back. The same pattern, the same number of steps, the same timing. It happened every single night without fail. I'm a light sleeper, and I work late hours because of deadlines, so I'm often still awake at that time. At first, I figured it was just a neighbor with insomnia, someone pacing because they couldn't sleep. Lots of people do that, but it was the precision that started to bother me. Exactly 2:47, exactly 7 steps, exactly the same pause, every night. After about 2 weeks of this, I went down to the building office during their business hours and asked the property manager about the tenant in Unit 412. She looked confused and pulled up the records on her computer. According to her system, that unit was still vacant. Had been vacant for over 18 months since before I moved in. I told her that couldn't be right because I heard someone walking around up there every night. She insisted the unit was empty, said they'd been having trouble renting it because it needed more extensive renovations than they'd initially thought, and the work kept getting delayed due to permit issues. She offered to let me come up and look at the unit if I wanted proof. I took her up on that offer. We went up to the 4th floor, and she unlocked Unit 412. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. The floors were dusty. The windows had grime on them like they hadn't been cleaned in months. There were paint cans and drop cloths in one corner, evidence of the renovation work she'd mentioned. The place looked and felt abandoned. I stood in the middle of the living room, directly above where my bedroom would be 1 floor down, and I couldn't explain what I'd been hearing. The property manager seemed sympathetic, but also slightly concerned, like she was wondering if I might be a problem tenant. She suggested that sound travels in strange ways in old buildings, that what I was hearing might be coming from a different unit, or even from the street outside. I thanked her for her time and went back to my apartment, feeling stupid but also deeply unsettled. That night at 2:47, I heard it again. 7 footsteps moving across the floor above me. Pause. 7 steps back. I got out of bed, put my ear against the ceiling, and listened. The footsteps were clear, distinct, definitely coming from directly overhead. The sound of hard-soled shoes, or boots on hardwood, each step producing that characteristic creak that old floors make. There was weight behind those steps. Something real and physical was walking up there. I started documenting it obsessively. I set up my phone to record audio every night, positioned it near the ceiling to capture the sounds as clearly as possible. I reviewed the recordings every morning, and they all captured the same thing. At exactly 2:47, footsteps would begin. 7 steps in one direction, pause, 7 steps back. The pattern would repeat for anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, and then it would stop. The recordings proved I wasn't imagining it, but they didn't explain what was causing it. I tried researching the building's history, looking for any information about incidents or deaths, but property records from that era are spotty and mostly not digitized. I found the building's original construction date, 1923, and a few mentions in old city directories, but nothing that seemed relevant to what I was experiencing. The footsteps continued nightly, and I started losing sleep even though I'd been used to staying up late. It's different when you're awake by choice versus being kept awake by something you can't explain or stop. I became irritable, had trouble concentrating on work, started drinking too much coffee to compensate for the exhaustion. Friends noticed I looked tired and asked if everything was okay. I tried explaining it to a couple of them, but their reactions ranged from amusement to concern that I was stressed out and imagining things. One friend suggested I talk to my doctor about sleep disorders or anxiety. Nobody took it seriously as an actual phenomenon happening in the physical world. By January, about 2 months into this pattern, I was at my breaking point. I decided to do something drastic. On the night of January 15th, at 2:45 in the morning, I left my apartment and went up to the 4th floor. I stood outside Unit 412 and waited. At exactly 2:47, I heard the footsteps begin inside the apartment. I could hear them clearly through the door, that same pattern, 7 steps, pause, 7 steps back. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency police line. I told the dispatcher I believed someone had broken into an empty apartment in my building and was squatting there. They said they'd send an officer to check it out. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later, and I met them in the lobby. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, trying not to sound hysterical or delusional. They seemed skeptical but professional, said they'd check it out. The property manager had given me her emergency contact number for situations like this, so I called her, and she showed up 15 minutes later with keys. We all went up to Unit 412 together, the 2 officers, the property manager, and me. She unlocked the door, and the officers went inside first with flashlights drawn. I stood in the doorway, watching as they cleared each room, checking the closets, the bathroom, looking for any signs of forced entry or occupancy. Nothing. The apartment was exactly as I'd seen it weeks earlier. Empty, dusty, undisturbed. The officers checked the windows, which were all locked from the inside. There was nowhere anyone could have hidden, and no way they could have gotten out without us seeing them. The property manager looked at me with barely concealed annoyance, clearly unhappy about being woken up in the middle of the night for what appeared to be a false alarm. The officers were more diplomatic, but I could tell they thought I'd wasted their time. One of them suggested that old buildings settle and create sounds that can seem like footsteps, especially at night when everything else is quiet. They left, and I went back to my apartment feeling humiliated and more confused than ever. But that night, after all that, at 2:47, the footsteps happened again. 7 steps, pause, 7 steps back. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to them, knowing with absolute certainty that something was up there, something that defied explanation but was undeniably real. I stopped trying to convince anyone else. I stopped calling the property manager or the police. I just endured it, night after night, slowly unraveling from lack of sleep and the psychological weight of living under something that shouldn't exist. In February, I started noticing another change. The footsteps were the same, but I began hearing something else. A dragging sound, like furniture being moved slowly across the floor. It would happen after the footsteps had been going for about 10 minutes. A heavy scraping sound, something large and solid being dragged from one end of the apartment to the other. This new sound made the hair on my neck stand up because it felt purposeful, like whatever was up there was doing something specific, some task it needed to complete. I recorded this too, building up a catalog of audio files that documented the progression of sounds. The dragging became a regular part of the pattern, footsteps for 10 minutes, then dragging for 5 minutes, then silence until the next night. I became obsessed with trying to understand what was happening. I spent hours reading about paranormal phenomena, residual hauntings, psychic imprints, all the theories that people use to explain things that don't fit into conventional reality. Some of it resonated, especially the concept of residual hauntings, where traumatic events leave an impression that replays itself over and over. But most of what I read felt like speculation, people trying to make sense of experiences that fundamentally resist explanation. In March, exactly 4 months after the footsteps first started, something changed dramatically. I woke up one night not to the sound of footsteps but to complete silence. I checked my phone. It was 2:53 in the morning. The footsteps should have started 6 minutes ago, but there was nothing. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear any sound from above, but the apartment was silent. I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that maybe it was finally over, whatever it had been. Anxiety because the absence of the familiar pattern felt almost worse than the pattern itself. Then I heard my apartment door handle rattle. Not the door to the building or to another apartment, but my door. Someone or something was trying to get into my apartment. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight app, pointing it at my front door from where I lay in bed. The handle turned slowly, deliberately. The door was locked, deadbolt engaged, but the handle kept turning back and forth like someone was testing it, seeing if it would open. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just watched that handle turn, lit up in the beam of my phone's flashlight, moving in the darkness. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like forever. Then it stopped. Footsteps moved away from my door, down the hallway outside my apartment toward the stairwell. I heard the stairwell door open and close. After that, nothing. Complete silence. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the apartment on, a kitchen knife on the table in front of me, even though I knew intellectually that a knife wasn't going to help me if something that could walk through locked apartments came back. When dawn finally came, I packed a bag and left. I called in sick to work and went to stay with a friend across town. Told him I needed to crash for a few days because of a problem with my apartment. He didn't ask too many questions, just said I could use his couch as long as I needed. I stayed there for 5 days, trying to work remotely, trying to function normally. But my mind kept going back to that door handle turning. When I finally went back to my apartment, everything seemed normal. I checked with neighbors on my floor, asked if they'd seen anyone unfamiliar in the building. Nobody had noticed anything unusual. The property manager confirmed that no maintenance workers or contractors had been in the building that night. I've been back in my apartment for 2 weeks now. The footsteps haven't returned. The apartment above me remains silent every night. But I don't feel relieved. I feel like I'm waiting for something. Every night when 2:47 approaches, I'm wide awake, listening, anticipating. And every night when it passes without incident, I don't relax. I just reset my internal clock and wait for the next night. I've started looking at other apartments, browsing rental listings, calculating if I can afford to break my lease early. My lease isn't up until September, 6 more months, and I don't know if I can last that long. Not because the sounds are still happening, but because they stopped. Because whatever was in that empty apartment above me, whatever was walking those 7 steps night after night, has moved. And I think it's moved closer. I keep my door locked and deadbolted at all times now. I've added a chain lock and a door wedge for extra security. But I know, deep in my bones, that physical locks aren't going to stop whatever this is. I just have to hope that whatever it wants, whatever it's been trying to do all these months, doesn't involve me. But I'm not optimistic. The building feels different now. The creaks and settling sounds that I used to find charming now feel threatening. Every shadow seems deeper. Every sound makes me flinch. I'm living in a state of constant vigilance, and I can feel it changing me, making me paranoid and hollow-eyed. My work is suffering. My relationships are suffering. But I can't explain any of this to anyone because I know how it sounds. I know what people will think. So I just endure it alone, waiting to see what happens next, hoping that when 2:47 comes around tonight, the silence continues. But also terrified of what that silence might mean. Would you stay or break the lease immediately? Let me know in the comments. My name is Tiago, and I'm a high school teacher who lives in Seattle. I take the ferry between Seattle and Bainbridge Island almost every weekday because I work at a school on the island but can't afford to live there. Housing prices on Bainbridge are insane, so I rent a small apartment in the city and commute. It's actually not a bad arrangement. The ferry ride takes about 35 minutes each way, and I've grown to appreciate that time. It's a buffer between work and home, a chance to decompress or grade papers, or just stare out at the water and think about nothing. I've been doing this commute for 3 years now, taking mostly the same ferry schedules, seeing the same regular commuters, falling into that comfortable rhythm that comes with routine. You start recognizing faces even if you never speak to them. The guy who always sits in the same corner reading thick paperback novels. The woman who knits elaborate scarves and never looks up from her needles. The business types who work on laptops the entire crossing. We're all part of this silent community of regular riders. About 7 months ago, in late October, I started noticing another regular passenger. A woman, probably in her late 30s or early 40s, always wearing a long gray coat regardless of the weather. She had dark hair pulled back severely from her face and an expression that I can only describe as profoundly sad. She never read, never used a phone, never spoke to anyone. She just sat in the same seat on the starboard side of the passenger deck, near the windows, and stared out at the water. Every single trip, morning and evening, she was there. Same seat, same posture, same empty stare. I noticed her because her stillness was so complete. Everyone else on the ferry is doing something, moving, fidgeting, existing in normal human ways. She was like a photograph, perfectly motionless, except for the slight sway of the ferry beneath us. Winter in the Pacific Northwest means early darkness, and by November, my evening commute home was always after sunset. The ferry becomes a different place at night. The interior lights create reflections on the windows, and outside is just blackness and the occasional lights from other vessels or the shore. Most people stay inside where it's warm, but some hardy souls still go out on the deck to feel the wind and smell the salt air. On the evening of November 20th, a Tuesday, I was sitting in my usual spot on the port side, trying to finish grading a stack of essays before I got home. The ferry was maybe 15 minutes from the Seattle terminal when I happened to glance across the aisle and noticed that the woman in the gray coat wasn't in her usual seat. I looked around, thinking maybe she'd gotten up to use the restroom or get coffee, but I didn't see her anywhere in the passenger cabin. Then I looked out the window and saw her standing at the exterior railing on the starboard side. That wasn't particularly unusual. People go outside all the time, but something about her posture caught my attention. She was gripping the railing with both hands, leaning forward slightly, looking down at the dark water rushing past below. There was an intensity to her stance that made my stomach tighten with concern. I put down the essays and watched her for a moment. She just stood there, motionless again, staring at the water. Other passengers walked past her without seeming to notice anything wrong. I debated whether I should go out there, say something to her, check if she was okay. Before I could decide, she moved. She swung one leg over the railing. My heart lurched. I jumped up from my seat and rushed toward the door to the deck, shouting for help. By the time I got the door open and stepped outside into the cold wind, she was gone. I ran to the railing where she'd been standing and looked over. Nothing. Just dark water churning in the ferry's wake, reflecting the lights from the boat. No splash that I could see or hear over the engine noise. No sign of her at all. I ran back inside and found a crew member, told him frantically that someone had just jumped overboard. He immediately radioed to the bridge, and within seconds the ferry's engines changed pitch, and we began to slow. An announcement came over the PA system asking all passengers to remain calm and stay seated, that there was a safety situation being addressed. More crew members appeared, some going outside with flashlights to scan the water, others taking statements. I was questioned by 2 different crew members, and then by a Coast Guard officer, who arrived via a smaller vessel that pulled alongside us. I told them everything I'd seen, the woman in the gray coat, her position at the railing, the way she'd gone over. They asked me to describe her. I did my best. Gray coat, dark hair, late 30s or early 40s, always sat in the same seat. They wrote it all down. Other passengers were questioned too, anyone who might have been on that section of deck around the same time. The ferry was held in place for over an hour while Coast Guard vessels searched the area with spotlights. They found nothing. Eventually, we were allowed to continue to Seattle. I gave my contact information to the authorities and was told someone would follow up with me. The other passengers were shaken, talking in hushed voices about what had happened. I overheard someone saying they'd seen emergency situations on the ferry before, but never an actual jumper. When we finally docked in Seattle, I walked off on unsteady legs and took a rideshare home instead of walking like I usually did. I barely slept that night. I kept seeing her going over that railing, kept wondering if there was something I could have done differently, if I'd reacted faster, whether I could have stopped her. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face getting on that ferry again, not yet. I spent the day obsessively checking news sites for any information about the incident. There was nothing. No news coverage at all. I found that strange. A suicide from a ferry should be news, shouldn't it? On Thursday, I forced myself to go back to work, dreading the ferry ride, but knowing I couldn't avoid it forever. I boarded the morning ferry with my stomach in knots, looking around at the other passengers, seeing the regular commuters in their usual spots. And there, in her usual seat on the starboard side, was the woman in the gray coat. Same posture, same empty stare out the window. My vision actually blurred for a second. I thought I might pass out. I stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, staring at her, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. She was dead. I'd watched her go over the railing. The Coast Guard had searched for her. But there she sat, as solid and real as anyone else on the ferry. I approached her slowly, my heart hammering. When I got close enough, I said her name, except I realized I didn't know her name. I just said, "Excuse me," asked if she was okay. She didn't respond, didn't even glance at me, just kept staring out the window at the gray water of Puget Sound. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and my hand went right through her. Not like touching air or mist, but like she wasn't physically there at all. My hand passed through the space where her shoulder should be, and I felt nothing. I jerked back, gasping, and looked around to see if anyone else had noticed. The other passengers were absorbed in their phones and books and conversations. Nobody was paying attention to me or to her. I spent the entire ferry ride watching her, unable to look away. She never moved, except for that slight sway with the motion of the boat. When we docked at Bainbridge, I followed her as she stood and walked toward the exit. She moved through the crowd of disembarking passengers, and I noticed that people seemed to unconsciously move aside for her, creating space without appearing to register her presence. She walked down the gangway and onto the terminal, then simply faded from view. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, like someone had turned down her opacity until she disappeared completely. I stood on the dock, shaking, trying to understand what I'd just witnessed. I made it through the school day somehow, teaching on autopilot, my mind completely elsewhere. That evening, on the return ferry to Seattle, she was there again. Same seat, same posture. And this time I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. She wasn't just staring at the water. She was watching something specific. Her eyes tracked along the surface as if following an object or a path that only she could see. Over the following weeks, I saw her on every single ferry trip, morning and evening without fail, and each time as we got closer to the spot where I'd seen her go over the railing, she would stand up and walk outside. I followed her once, watched as she gripped the railing in that same position, leaned forward in that same way. But she never went over again. She'd just stand there for a few minutes, then turn and walk back inside before the ferry docked. It was like she was caught in a loop, replaying something over and over, but never quite completing it again. I tried to research ferry suicides, looking for any historical incidents that might match what I was seeing. The ferry system has been running for over 60 years, and while suicides have happened, they're not well documented publicly. I found a few scattered references in old news archives, but nothing specific enough to identify who this woman might have been, or when she died, if she was even dead in any conventional sense. I became obsessed with understanding her pattern. I started taking notes, documenting every appearance, every movement. I noticed that other regular commuters never seemed to see her, never sat in her seat even when the ferry was crowded, and seats were scarce. It was like that space was reserved, marked off by some unconscious boundary that everyone respected without knowing why. I also noticed that she appeared more solid on certain days than others. On overcast days, when the water was gray and choppy, she was almost completely opaque, nearly indistinguishable from a living person. On clear, sunny days, she was translucent, easier to see through. I wondered if she was connected somehow to the weather, to the state of the water, if whatever phenomenon was creating her presence was stronger under certain conditions. In January, I worked up the courage to try communicating with her differently. Instead of speaking, which clearly didn't work, I brought a notebook and wrote questions, held them up for her to see. Who are you? When did you die? Why are you still here? She never responded, never even glanced at the notebook. Her attention remained fixed on the water outside the window. Then in February, something changed. I was on the evening ferry, sitting across from where she sat, watching her, as I'd gotten into the habit of doing. We were approaching the area where I'd seen her jump, and she stood up as usual to go outside. But this time, instead of walking to the door, she turned and looked directly at me. It was the first time in 4 months of observation that she'd acknowledged my existence in any way. Her eyes locked onto mine, and the sadness in them was so profound that I felt it physically, like a weight pressing on my chest. She held my gaze for maybe 5 seconds, and then she spoke. I didn't hear her voice audibly, but I heard it in my head, clear as if she'd whispered directly into my ear. She said one word, "Remember." Then she turned and walked outside. I followed her, pushing through other passengers, desperate to understand what she meant. By the time I got outside, she was at the railing again, in that same position. But this time she looked back at me once more before she let go and dropped backward over the railing into the water. I ran to the edge and looked down, expecting to see nothing like before. But this time I saw her body hit the water, saw the splash, saw her gray coat spreading out on the surface like a flower opening. I screamed for help, and this time crew members came running immediately. This time the emergency protocols activated instantly. This time the Coast Guard was called and arrived within 20 minutes. And this time they found something. They pulled a body from the water, a woman in a gray coat with dark hair pulled back from her face. The Coast Guard officer who'd responded told me that based on the condition of the body, the clothing, various factors they considered, the woman had been in the water for years. He said they'd try to identify her, match her to missing person reports. He thanked me for reporting what I'd seen, said that maybe now her family would get closure. I realized then what she'd meant by remember. She'd been trapped in that loop, riding the ferry over and over, jumping over and over in some echo of her death, and somehow I'd been the catalyst that let her finish it. That let her body be found, let her be remembered as a real person who died, not just a ghost on a commuter ferry that nobody noticed. I still take the ferry to work. I still sit in my usual spot and grade papers and stare out at the water. But I don't see her anymore. Her seat remains empty, and now other passengers sit there without hesitation, without that unconscious avoidance. Sometimes I think about her and wonder who she was, if her family ever did get answers, if knowing what happened brought them any peace. Mostly I think about how many people walked past her every day, sat near her, shared space with her, and never saw her at all. How invisible someone can become even when they're right there in front of you, riding the same ferry, trapped in the same routine, silently screaming for someone to notice. I notice now. I look at the other regular passengers differently, wondering what stories they're carrying, what pain they're hiding, and I watch the railing more carefully on every crossing, making sure nobody living is standing there with that same posture, that same forward lean, that same look of someone about to let go. If you saw someone at the railing, would you intervene or assume they just wanted fresh air? Share your thoughts below. My name is Isaiah, and my name is Soraya, and this is the story of what happened to us in Forks, Washington last September. We're both in our early 30s, been together for about 4 years, and we'd planned this trip as a kind of anniversary getaway. We're both fans of the Twilight series. I know that sounds silly to admit as adults, but those books and movies meant something to us when we were younger, and we thought it would be fun and nostalgic to visit the actual town where the story was set. Forks is this tiny logging town on the Olympic Peninsula, surrounded by dense rainforest, perpetually overcast, exactly the moody, atmospheric place you'd expect. We'd booked an Airbnb for 3 nights, a cabin that was listed as being about 6 miles outside of town, secluded and charming according to the photos. The host had great reviews, the price was reasonable, and the listing promised an authentic Pacific Northwest experience with modern amenities. Perfect for what we wanted. We drove up from Portland on a Friday afternoon. Took us about 5 hours with stops. The last stretch of road getting to the cabin was rough, a narrow gravel path that wound through increasingly dense forest. Our GPS kept losing signal, but we had the address and the host had sent detailed directions. We found the turnoff where we were supposed to, drove another 2 miles down what was barely more than a dirt track, and finally arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. It looked exactly like the photos. Small but well-maintained, log construction with a covered porch, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. There was a fire pit in front, and what looked like a hiking trail leading off into the woods behind the property. The host had said he'd leave the door unlocked for us since we were arriving after his office hours, and the keys would be on the kitchen counter. We grabbed our bags from the car and went inside. The interior was cozy. Open floor plan with a kitchen area, living room with a fireplace, 2 doors leading to what we assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was rustic but clean, decorated with the kind of generic cabin aesthetic you see in rentals, wood furniture, and landscape prints and throw blankets. We found the keys on the counter just like the host had said, along with a welcome note that included the Wi-Fi password and some recommendations for restaurants in town. We unpacked, made dinner from groceries we'd brought, opened a bottle of wine, and spent the evening relaxing by the fire. It was perfect. Exactly what we'd wanted. We went to bed around 11, exhausted from the drive, and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up first, around 3 in the morning. I'm usually a solid sleeper, but something had pulled me out of sleep. Some noise or sensation I couldn't immediately identify. The cabin was dark and quiet. Soraya was still asleep beside me. I lay there for a minute listening, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the porch outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving from one end of the porch to the other. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear, but the rhythm was wrong. Too measured, too human. I got up carefully, trying not to wake Soraya, and went to the window. The curtains were thick, and I couldn't see through them without pulling them aside, which I didn't want to do. The footsteps continued for another minute or so, then stopped. I waited, heart beating faster now, but there was no other sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it had probably been some animal after all and went back to bed. I didn't mention it to Soraya in the morning. Didn't want to worry her over nothing. We spent Saturday exploring Forks and the surrounding area. Visited the Timber Museum, drove out to some of the beaches, took touristy photos at locations mentioned in the books. It was fun and silly and romantic. We got back to the cabin around 7 in the evening, made dinner, and settled in for another quiet night. We were watching a movie on my laptop when the Wi-Fi suddenly cut out. Isaiah checked the router, unplugged it, and plugged it back in. But we couldn't get a connection. Cell service had been spotty since we arrived, only 1 or 2 bars, so we couldn't even use our phones as hotspots. We decided to just call it an early night, read for a while, and go to sleep. Around midnight, I got up to use the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I noticed something odd. There was condensation on the bathroom mirror, like someone had just taken a hot shower, but the bathroom was cold, and neither of us had showered since that morning. I wiped the mirror with my hand and saw something that made my stomach drop. there were words written in the condensation. Someone had written on the mirror from the inside of the glass, or that's how it appeared. The words said, "Leave now," in simple block letters. I called for Isaiah, trying to keep my voice steady. He came in and saw what I was looking at. We both just stood there, staring at those words. He tried to rationalize it, said maybe the condensation had been there from earlier, and we just hadn't noticed, that the pattern might have been random and only looked like words because our brains were trying to find meaning. But we both knew that wasn't true. Those were deliberate letters, a clear message. We checked all the doors and windows, made sure everything was locked. We didn't see any signs of forced entry or anyone else in the cabin. We briefly discussed leaving right then, packing up and driving back to Portland in the middle of the night, but that seemed like an overreaction. The doors were locked, we had our phones, even if the service was bad, and we'd paid for 3 nights. We decided to stick it out until morning and then decide what to do. We went back to bed, but neither of us could sleep. We lay there in the dark, holding hands, listening to every creak and settle of the old cabin. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A sound coming from the living room. A dragging sound, like furniture being moved slowly across the floor. Isaiah heard it too. We both sat up, and he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. We crept to the bedroom door, and he opened it slowly. The living room was dark. He swept the flashlight beam around, illuminating the space. Everything looked normal. The furniture was exactly where it had been. Nothing had moved. But then we heard it again, that dragging sound, and this time we could tell it was coming from above us, from the roof. Something heavy was being dragged across the roof of the cabin, from one end to the other, slow and deliberate. We stood there frozen, listening to it move back and forth directly over our heads. This went on for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. That's when we decided we were leaving. We didn't care that it was the middle of the night, or that we'd lose our money on the rental. We threw our belongings into our bags as quickly as we could, not bothering to pack neatly, just wanting to get out. I grabbed the car keys from the kitchen counter, and we headed for the front door. Isaiah unlocked it and pulled it open. Our car was gone. The spot where we'd parked it was empty, just dirt and gravel and the dark forest beyond. We both stood there in shock, trying to process what we were seeing. Our car couldn't have been stolen because we'd heard no engine, no sounds of anyone approaching or leaving. It couldn't have rolled away because we'd parked on flat ground with the parking brake engaged. It was simply gone. Soraya started to panic, her breathing getting rapid and shallow. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but there was no signal at all now, not even one bar. I checked Soraya's phone. Same thing, no signal. We went back inside and locked the door, which felt absurd because clearly locks weren't keeping anything out or protecting anything we owned. We tried the landline that was listed in the cabin amenities, but when I picked up the phone, there was no dial tone, just dead silence. We were completely cut off. I suggested we wait until dawn and then walk out to the main road, flag down a passing car if we had to. It was only about 2 miles back to the turnoff, and from there, it was another 4 miles to town. We could make it on foot if necessary. We just had to survive until daylight. We pushed the couch against the front door as an extra barrier and sat together on the floor with our backs against it, watching the windows, waiting for dawn. The next few hours were the longest of my life. Every sound from outside made us flinch. We heard what sounded like footsteps circling the cabin, moving through the brush around the perimeter. We heard scratching on the walls, on the windows, like something with claws was testing the exterior, looking for weak points. Around 4 in the morning, we heard voices, multiple voices outside, having a conversation we couldn't quite make out. They sounded human, normal speech patterns and tones, but we couldn't understand the words. The voices would get closer to the cabin, then farther away, then closer again, like people were walking around the property having a casual discussion. Isaiah called out, asked who was there, said we needed help. The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence. Then we heard our own voices played back to us. Isaiah's voice saying, "Who's there?" and my voice saying, "We need help," coming from outside the cabin, from different directions, like recordings being broadcast from multiple points around us. Our own words echoed back at us in our own voices, but wrong somehow, the inflection slightly off, the timing not quite right. We stopped talking after that. We just held each other and waited, counting down the minutes until sunrise. When the first gray light finally started filtering through the windows, we grabbed our bags and cautiously opened the front door. The forest looked normal in the dawn light, misty and quiet and peaceful. And there, parked exactly where we'd left it the night before, was our car. Keys were still in my pocket where they'd been all night. We approached it slowly, expecting it to disappear or something else horrible to happen, but it was real and solid. We threw our bags in the back and got in, and Isaiah started the engine immediately. We drove out of there as fast as the rough road would allow, not looking back. When we got cell service about 20 minutes later, I pulled over, and we both tried to make sense of what had happened. We called the Airbnb host, but there was no answer. I left a message explaining that we'd had a situation at the property and had to leave early. We drove straight through back to Portland, taking turns driving because we were both exhausted and shaking from adrenaline. Later that day, I went back to the Airbnb listing to leave a review and report what had happened. The listing was gone, completely removed from the platform. No record of it existing. I checked my email for the confirmation and host messages. Those emails were gone too, like they'd been deleted from my account, but I never deleted them. I checked my credit card statement for the charge. There was no charge, no record of the transaction. According to every digital record, we'd never booked that cabin, never stayed there, never communicated with any host. But we have the photos we took on Saturday during our day trip to Forks. We have the physical evidence of our 3 days away. Soraya still has nightmares about it. We both do. We hear our own voices sometimes in our apartment, echoing back things we've just said. And we have to remind ourselves that it's just our minds playing tricks, residual trauma from that night. We've never gone back to that area, and we never will. The worst part is not knowing what was in that cabin with us or what it wanted. Not knowing if it was something that exists in that specific place or something that could have followed us home. We check our locks obsessively now. We don't like staying anywhere isolated or rural. We stick to cities, to places with neighbors close by, to spaces where help is always nearby. Sometimes I think about reporting it to authorities. But what would I say? We stayed in a cabin that no longer exists and experienced things that can't be explained. They'd think we were delusional or making it up. So we just live with it, carry it with us, and try not to think too much about what might have happened if we'd stayed until morning like we originally planned. If we'd tried to wait it out instead of running, we don't know and we don't want to know. Have you ever felt like you needed to leave somewhere immediately, even if you couldn't explain why? Tell us what you'd have done. My name is Indigo, and I'm a climate scientist specializing in atmospheric research. My work involves spending extended periods at remote weather stations, collecting data on temperature patterns, precipitation, wind speed, and various other meteorological phenomena. I've been doing this for almost 12 years. And I'm comfortable with isolation in ways most people aren't. I've spent weeks alone in research stations in Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, always during winter, when the data collection is most valuable and the conditions are most extreme. The solitude has never bothered me. I actually prefer it to the politics and social dynamics of university lab work. In mid-January of this year, I was assigned a 2-week rotation at a station in the North Cascades of Washington State. The facility is located at about 5,000 feet elevation, accessible only by snowmobile during winter months, surrounded by wilderness in every direction. The nearest town is over 30 miles away, and in January, with the snowpack that area gets, You might as well be on another planet. The station itself is small but well designed for its purpose. A single-room structure with thick insulated walls, a kitchenette area, a bunk, a desk with computer equipment for data logging, and various monitoring instruments both inside and mounted on the exterior. There's a radio for emergency communication and a satellite phone that works most of the time when weather permits. The previous researcher had finished his rotation and snowmobiled out the day before I arrived. The handoff procedure is standard. He leaves his final reports and notes, ensures all equipment is functioning, and I come in for my 2 weeks. I arrived on January 14th, around noon, dropped off by a contracted transport service that would return to pick me up on the 28th. The driver helped me unload my supplies, gave me the standard safety briefing about weather conditions and emergency protocols, and left. I watched his snowmobile disappear into the trees, and then I was alone. The first 3 days were routine. I settled into my schedule, wake at 6, check and record instrument readings, transmit data back to the university via satellite uplink, eat breakfast, perform maintenance checks on exterior equipment, more data collection in the afternoon, dinner, evening readings, sleep by 10. The weather was clear and brutally cold, temperatures dropping to around 15 below zero at night. The station has excellent heating, and I had proper cold weather gear for the brief periods I needed to be outside. On the 4th night, January 17th, something woke me around 2 in the morning. I opened my eyes in the darkness and listened. The wind had picked up, which was normal. The building creaked and settled, also normal. But there was another sound underneath those familiar noises. A knocking. Someone was knocking on the door. 3 deliberate knocks. Pause. 3 more knocks. I sat up in my bunk, my heart rate accelerating. There shouldn't be anyone within 30 miles of this station. No other researchers were scheduled in this area. No recreational activity happens up here in winter. Nothing. I got out of bed and moved toward the door, staying to the side of the small window rather than looking directly through it. The exterior floodlight was on, illuminating a circle of snow around the entrance. I couldn't see anyone. The knocking came again, same pattern, 3 knocks with that pause. I called out, asking who was there, if someone needed help. No response, just wind and that relentless knocking. I checked the radio to see if there had been any emergency broadcasts, any notifications about other personnel in the area. Nothing. The satellite phone had signal, and I considered calling my supervisor, but what would I say? Someone knocked on my door in the middle of the night. That wasn't exactly an emergency, and I'd be violating protocol by calling for non-emergency situations. I decided to look through the window, properly. I pressed my face close to the cold glass and looked out at the illuminated area. Nobody was there. The snow around the entrance was undisturbed except for my own footprints from earlier in the evening, when I'd gone out to clear ice off one of the instruments. No new tracks, no evidence anyone had approached the building. The knocking had stopped. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. I lay there listening, watching the faint light from the instrument displays cast shadows on the ceiling. Around 4 in the morning, the knocking started again. Same pattern, same rhythm, 3 knocks, and pause. I didn't get up this time. I just lay there, my whole body tense, listening to it continue for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Then it stopped, and I didn't hear it again until the following night. Same time, 2 in the morning, same knocking pattern. This time I forced myself to open the door. I unlocked it, pulled it open, letting in a blast of freezing air. Nothing. No person, no animal. Just the dark forest and the wind and temperatures cold enough to kill an unprotected human in minutes. The nearest trees were about 50 yards away, too far for anyone to reach in the seconds between when the knocking stopped and when I opened the door. I closed and locked the door, checked all the windows, examined every possible entry point. The station was secure. Over the next few days, the knocking became a nightly occurrence. Always at 2 in the morning, always the same pattern. I stopped responding to it, stopped checking. I just endured it. lying in my bunk, waiting for it to end. I told myself it was some acoustic phenomenon, wind creating percussion against the building in a way that sounded like knocking. That explanation didn't satisfy me, but it was better than the alternatives. On January 22nd, my 10th day at the station, the pattern changed. I woke at 2 as I'd started doing, automatically, anticipating the knocking. It came as expected, but this time it was accompanied by a voice. A woman's voice, muffled by the door and the wind, calling my name. Not hello or help or any generic plea. My actual name. Indigo. 3 knocks, then my name. 3 knocks, then my name again. The voice was familiar in a way I couldn't place, like someone I'd known long ago but couldn't quite remember. I got up and approached the door, my hands shaking. I called out, asking who was there, how they knew my name. The voice responded immediately. "Let me in, Indigo. It's so cold out here. Please let me in." The tone was pleading, desperate. I put my hand on the door handle, some instinct to help overriding my fear. Then I stopped. Something about the voice was wrong. The words were right. The emotion seemed genuine. But there was an artificial quality underneath it, like someone reading lines without really understanding them. I took my hand off the handle and stepped back. "Who are you?" I asked. "How do you know my name?" The voice didn't answer the questions. It just repeated the same plea. "Let me in, Indigo. It's so cold, please." I backed away from the door, and the voice grew louder, more insistent, dropping the pleading tone and becoming demanding. "Let me in. Open the door. Let me in now." I grabbed the radio and tried to reach the emergency frequency, but all I got was static. The satellite phone had no signal despite clear skies. Every method of communication was down. The voice outside continued, no longer forming words now, just making sounds that approximated speech but had no meaning. I realized with horror that it had never been a person. It was something mimicking human speech, and it had either learned my name from monitoring the station somehow or pulled it from some other source I couldn't fathom. The sounds continued for over an hour, rising and falling in volume, sometimes sounding like my mother's voice, sometimes like an old friend, sometimes like people I'd worked with, cycling through familiar voices that it had no right to know. Eventually it stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat at my desk with all the lights on, watching the windows, listening for any sound. At dawn, I went outside with a flashlight, even though the sun was coming up, and I examined the area around the door and windows. The snow was covered with marks, not footprints exactly, but depressions and patterns that suggested something had circled the building multiple times. The marks were strange, irregular, sometimes looking almost like prints from bare feet despite the deadly cold. Other times looking like nothing I recognized. I took photos, documented everything, and when I came back inside, I immediately tried the radio again. This time, it worked. I contacted my supervisor and told him I needed emergency extraction, that there was a situation at the station. He asked, "What kind of situation?" I didn't know how to explain it without sounding unstable, so I said I'd been experiencing possible carbon monoxide exposure symptoms and needed to leave for medical evaluation. He took that seriously and said they'd send transport the next day when weather permitted. That final night was the worst. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the chair with my coat on, my emergency pack beside me, the satellite phone in my hand, even though it still had no signal. At 2 a.m, the knocking started again, but now it was coming from all sides. Every wall, the roof, like multiple things surrounding the building and hammering on every surface simultaneously. The windows rattled in their frames. The whole structure shook. Then the voice came back. But now it wasn't trying to mimic anyone I knew. It was my voice, my exact voice, speaking from outside, saying things I'd said over the past 10 days. Phrases from my data logs, things I'd muttered to myself while cooking, fragments of conversations I'd had on the radio before communications went down. My own words played back at me from the darkness outside. overlapping and echoing until it became a horrible cacophony of my voice, saying nonsense. I put my hands over my ears, but I could still hear it. Could feel it in my bones, in my teeth, vibrating through the structure of the building. It went on until dawn. The moment the first light appeared on the horizon, it stopped instantly. Complete silence except for the wind. I sat there shaking, exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced. The transport arrived around 10 in the morning, and I'd never been happier to see another human being. The driver asked if I was okay, said I looked terrible. I told him I'd been sick, needed to get to lower elevation. We loaded my essential equipment and left the rest. I didn't care. I just wanted out. During the ride down the mountain, I asked him if he'd heard anything unusual when he approached the station. He said no, everything seemed normal. The snow around the building looked undisturbed to him. I showed him the photos I'd taken of the strange marks, but on my phone screen they just looked like random disturbances in the snow, nothing clearly unusual. He probably thought I'd had some kind of mental breakdown from isolation. Back at the university, I filed my report and included everything that happened. My supervisor was sympathetic but skeptical. He suggested I take some time off, consider whether field work was still right for me given the stress response I'd experienced. The official explanation in the records is that I had a possible adverse reaction to isolation and requested early extraction. The station is still operational. Other researchers have completed rotations there since I left, and, according to official reports, none of them experienced anything unusual. But I've talked quietly to a few of them, asked indirect questions about their time there, and I've seen the look in their eyes when certain topics come up. They know something. They experience something. They just won't talk about it officially any more than I did, because who would believe us? I've requested to be assigned only to stations with multiple personnel now, places where I'm never completely alone. My supervisor granted the request without question. I think he understands more than he's willing to say. I still have nightmares about that voice, about hearing myself speak from outside the building, my words twisted and wrong, about whatever was circling that station in the dark, testing the walls, learning my voice, trying to make me open that door. Sometimes, in my apartment in the city, late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear knocking. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I know it's just my mind, just trauma manifesting as auditory hallucinations, but knowing that doesn't make it any less terrifying, doesn't stop me from checking the locks compulsively, from sleeping with the lights on more often than I'd like to admit. I was always so confident in my ability to handle isolation, so certain that solitude was where I belonged. That certainty is gone now. I know what it's like to be truly alone with something that shouldn't exist, something that wants in. And I know that the thin walls of a remote research station are nowhere near enough protection when something patient and hungry finds you in the dark. Would you open the door if you heard someone calling your name in the middle of nowhere? Comment below what you think was out there. My name is Yasmin, and I work as a dispatcher for the Washington State Patrol. I've been doing this job for almost 7 years now, based out of the Communications Center in Olympia. If you've never worked in emergency dispatch, it's hard to explain the particular kind of stress that comes with it. You're the voice on the other end of the line when someone is having the worst moment of their life. You hear things that stay with you, voices full of panic and fear and desperation, and you have to stay calm and professional and get them the help they need. You develop a thick skin out of necessity, learn to compartmentalize, to separate yourself emotionally from the calls you take. I thought I was good at that. I thought I'd heard everything that dispatch could throw at me. Then I took a call on the night of March 9th that shattered every assumption I had about my job and about reality itself. It was a Friday night, around 11:30. I'd been on shift since 3 in the afternoon and was looking forward to getting off at midnight. The call center was moderately busy, typical for a Friday evening with the usual mix of traffic accidents, domestic disturbances, drunk driving reports. I was finishing up paperwork from a previous call when a new one came through to my station. I answered with my standard greeting, identifying myself and asking about the nature of the emergency. The voice on the other end was female, young, breathing hard like she'd been running. She said she was being followed on Interstate 5, northbound near Tacoma. She gave me her location, said she was driving a blue Honda sedan, and that another vehicle had been following her for the past 20 minutes, matching her speed, getting too close, making her feel unsafe. This isn't an uncommon call. We get reports of aggressive drivers or potential road rage situations regularly. I told her to stay on the line, that I was dispatching units to her location, and asked her to describe the vehicle following her. She described it as a dark sedan, possibly black or dark blue, older model, maybe from the early 2000s. She couldn't see the driver clearly because the headlights were too bright in her rearview mirror. She said she'd tried changing lanes multiple times, speeding up and slowing down, even taking an exit and getting back on the highway, but the vehicle stayed with her. Her voice had a quality beyond normal fear. There was something visceral in it, a terror that made the hair on my arm stand up even through the phone line. I kept her talking, kept her focused, and confirmed that I had 2 patrol units heading toward her location with an estimated arrival time of 4 minutes. I told her to stay in the right lane, keep her speed steady, and that officers would be there soon. She acknowledged this, but her breathing was getting more erratic. Then she said something that made me pause. She said the vehicle had been following her since she left work, that she'd first noticed it in her work parking lot, that it had pulled out right after she did and hadn't left her sight since. I asked where she worked and when she'd left. She said she was a waitress at a diner off exit 127 and had left around 11. I did quick mental math. That meant this vehicle had been following her for over 30 minutes, through surface streets and then onto the highway. That elevated this from aggressive driving to potential stalking or something worse. I updated the responding units with this information and told them to treat it as a possible pursuit situation. The woman on the phone, I'll call her by the name I later learned from the incident report. She asked me to stay on the line with her, said she was too scared to be silent. I assured her I wasn't going anywhere, that I'd stay with her until officers arrived. Then she said something strange. She said the car following her looked familiar, that she thought she recognized it but couldn't place from where. She said it looked like a car that used to belong to someone she knew, but that person had died 3 years ago. I asked her to clarify what she meant. Her voice got quieter, more uncertain. She said when she was in high school, a girl she'd been friends with had died in a car accident. The girl had been driving home late at night on this same stretch of Interstate 5 when she'd lost control and crashed. The vehicle had gone off the road and down an embankment. The girl had died on impact. The car had been a dark blue sedan from the early 2000s. The woman on the phone, she said the car following her looked exactly like that car. Same make and model. Same damage to the front bumper from a previous minor accident. Same details she remembered from when her friend was alive. But that was impossible, she said, because that car had been totaled in the crash, completely destroyed. I didn't know what to say to that. I kept my voice professional and told her that it was probably just a similar-looking vehicle, that stress and fear can make us see patterns that aren't really there. But even as I said it, I felt wrong about dismissing her observation. Our units were 2 minutes out now. I could see their positions on my computer screen, moving fast up Interstate 5 toward her location. I asked her to confirm her current position. She gave me a mile marker that matched what I was seeing from the GPS trace on her phone. Then her voice changed. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was panicking. She said the vehicle had pulled alongside her in the left lane. She could see it now through her driver's side window. I told her not to look at it, to keep her eyes on the road, that officers were almost there. She wasn't listening to me. She was describing what she was seeing. She said there was someone in the driver's seat, but she couldn't see their face, just a silhouette. She said the vehicle was matching her speed exactly, staying perfectly parallel. Then she screamed, Not a scream of fear, but of recognition. She screamed a name, a woman's name, and said, "It's her. Oh God, it's her. She's looking at me." I was trying to get her to calm down, trying to get her to focus on the road, but she wasn't responding to me anymore. I could hear her hyperventilating, could hear her car's engine revving as she accelerated. I checked the screen. My units were less than a mile behind her now, lights and sirens active. I told her this, told her help was right behind her, just seconds away. She said the other car was still beside her, that the driver had turned to look at her fully now, and that it was definitely her dead friend. She said she could see her face clearly now, that she looked exactly the same as the night she died, and that she was smiling. Not a friendly smile, a wrong smile. She kept saying, "Wrong, wrong, her smile is wrong." Then I heard the sound of impact, metal on metal, a horrible crunching sound. The woman screamed again, and I heard her car swerving, heard the squeal of tires. Then the line went dead. Complete silence. The GPS trace on my screen showed her vehicle had stopped. The patrol units reached the location within seconds. I waited, my heart pounding, listening to the radio traffic between the responding officers. They reported finding a single vehicle on the shoulder, a blue Honda sedan, driver's side door open, engine still running. No sign of the driver, no sign of any other vehicle. They searched the immediate area, checked the embankment on both sides of the highway, looked for any evidence of where she might have gone or what might have happened. Nothing. The woman had vanished. There were scrape marks along the driver's side of her car, fresh damage consistent with a sideswipe collision, but no paint transfer, no debris, nothing that would indicate what she'd hit or what had hit her. More units arrived. They expanded the search, brought in dogs, checked traffic cameras. The cameras showed her vehicle driving normally, then swerving slightly, then pulling over. No other vehicle was visible in any of the footage. She appeared to be alone on that stretch of highway. I stayed on shift 2 hours past my scheduled end time, waiting for updates, hoping she'd be found. They never found her. Not that night, not in the days that followed. Her car was impounded and processed. Her phone was still in the vehicle, the call log showing our conversation, showing it had lasted 11 minutes and 37 seconds before disconnecting. But there was no physical evidence of what had happened to her. No blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of where she'd gone after stopping the car. The investigation tried to build a narrative around her voluntarily leaving, maybe staging the whole thing, but it didn't make sense. Why would she call 911, stay on the line with me, provide real-time updates of her location just to abandon her car and disappear? The official conclusion was inconclusive. Missing. Person. Circumstances unknown. But I knew what I'd heard. I'd heard genuine terror in her voice. I'd heard her recognize someone who should have been dead. I'd heard the impact. I requested the audio recording of the call, listened to it over and over, trying to find something I'd missed in real time. Toward the end of the call, just before the crash sound, there's something else in the background. A voice, faint, almost inaudible under her screaming and the road noise. Another woman's voice saying something. I had the audio analyzed, enhanced, trying to isolate that second voice. The technician was able to clean it up enough to make out some of the words. The voice was saying, "Come with me," repeated several times. Then, just before the line went dead, it said something else. It said, "It's your turn now." Those words have haunted me every single day since. I started researching the accident that had killed the woman's friend 3 years earlier. Found the police report, the news coverage, the memorial pages online. Her name had been Zara, and she'd been 21 when she died. The accident report stated she'd lost control of her vehicle on Interstate 5 near Tacoma, overcorrected, and gone off the road. Single vehicle accident, no other cars involved, no witnesses. But in the comments on one of the memorial pages, I found something interesting. Several people mentioned that on the night Zara died, she'd called friends saying she thought someone was following her. She described a vehicle that kept pace with her, that wouldn't let her pass or slow down. She'd been scared. Then she'd crashed. I dug deeper and found 2 other accidents on that same stretch of Interstate 5, both single vehicle, both involving young women driving alone at night, both within the past 5 years. In each case, there were mentions in police reports or witness statements of the victim calling someone before the crash, saying they were being followed. I compiled all this information and took it to my supervisor. He listened, looked uncomfortable, and told me I needed to take some time off. He said I was too emotionally invested in this case, that it was affecting my judgment. He wasn't wrong about the emotional investment, but he was wrong about my judgment. I knew what I'd heard. I knew that woman had experienced something real, something that had taken her. After that conversation with my supervisor, I didn't push it further officially, but I haven't stopped thinking about it. Every time I take a call now, especially late-night calls involving someone being followed on that stretch of highway, my pulse spikes. I listen more carefully. I document everything. I've taken 3 more similar calls in the month since, all different callers, all describing vehicles following them in that area. Each time I've gotten units there fast enough that the caller was still present when officers arrived, and each time the other vehicle was gone by the time help showed up. No evidence, no other witnesses, just scared drivers who swear they were being pursued by something. I've started warning people when I can, when the calls are appropriate for it. If someone reports being followed on Interstate 5 near Tacoma late at night, I tell them to take the next exit immediately, to get off the highway and go somewhere public, somewhere with lights and people. Most of them do, and most of them are fine, but I wonder how many don't listen, how many keep driving, how many end up like the woman from March 9th. I've requested transfers twice, asking to be moved to a different district, a different shift, anything that would take me away from that sector. Both requests were denied due to staffing needs. So I stay, and I answer the calls, and I do my job. But every shift I work, especially the night shifts, I dread hearing that particular tone of fear in someone's voice. I dread hearing them describe a car that matches their speed too perfectly, that follows too deliberately. And I dread the moment when they'll recognize the driver and scream a name that shouldn't be possible. Because I know now that there's something on that highway, something that appears as someone you knew, someone who died there, and it wants you to follow them into whatever darkness took them. I couldn't save the woman who called me in March. I couldn't protect her from something I didn't understand, and still don't understand. But I try every day to save the next person who calls, the next voice full of fear on the other end of the line, hoping that maybe this time the outcome will be different. If you were the dispatcher, would you believe the caller or think they were seeing things? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know what you think happened to her. Thanks for watching Bleak Fears. If these stories kept you up tonight, make sure you hit subscribe because we bring you disturbing true horror stories every single night. More darkness is waiting for you tomorrow, so turn on notifications and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.